Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to my creative world. In today's video, I'm going to give you guys a quick and dirty editing breakdown of the following image. So the first step was setting my aspect ratio to 16:9 and making any leveling adjustments that I had to. The step after that is cutting my subject out from the background. I chose to use the pen tool, but pick whatever method works best for you. I then made my background image. I used a program called Cinema 4D. The making of this scene was fairly simple. I first brought in my original image so I could match up the camera angle and focal length. I started out with just a regular flat plane, but then I changed my mind to make a seamless backdrop instead. Since I lit my subject with a large light from behind, I was sure to add a 3D light source from behind to make the image more convincing. I also added a 3D spotlight, again to match the original photo. For the ground texturing, I used PBR Textures, which are physically based rendering textures. The specific one I used is a marble texture from Polygon.com that I made some minor adjustments to. After everything was to where I wanted, I exported the image using Octane and brought it into Photoshop. I started off by painting in the shadows in between the subject layer and the background layer. I created a curves adjustment, darkened the image, and then I inverted the layer mask so the effect was no longer visible. With the layer mask selected, I used a white brush and I painted in wherever I wanted there to be shadows. It's important to note the size of the light source. The smaller a light source is, the harder the shadows will be. The larger the light source is, the softer the shadows will be. I referenced the shadows on the original image to make sure that I was painting in something that was realistic and believable. I then made localized exposure adjustments to make sure that the parts of the image that I wanted to bring attention to were the brightest. I did this by duplicating the subject layer, brightening it, and adding an inverted layer mask. I then used a large, soft, round brush and painted in the areas that I wanted to be brighter. This is very similar to dodge and burn, but it's not quite as meticulous. For skin retouching, I used a method called frequency separation. If you're not sure how to do this, I'll go ahead and drop a link to a tutorial down below in the description where you can also download the Photoshop action. Since I'm pretty lazy with the initial subject cutouts, a lot of the stray hairs get cut off, so I decided to paint them back in manually with a small soft brush, sampling the colors of the hair. The next step is dodge and burn. Again, there are multiple methods of doing this. I chose to use curve layers, one that darkens the image and one that brightens the image. By creating the layers with a black layer mask, I can then use a white brush to paint in where I want the effect to be. The main focus of this step is to create dimension. The same way you can shade a circle to make it seem like a sphere is the same principle that I'm using. This helps the subject pop out from the image a bit. It's easy to go overboard, so I'll usually dial down the overall effect to about 70%. After I finish all of my exposure and skin retouching adjustments, I move on to the special effects. For this image, I decided to add blood to the ground and to the subject's face. This was a pretty experimental process for me as I was trying out a lot of different methods to see what worked best. I started off with some stock images of paint splatters. I got these from a website called pixabay.com, which offers stock images free for commercial use. As I brought each image into Photoshop, I changed the hue and saturation to a red color. I then positioned the splatters using the perspective transform and warp tools. Once the blood was in a position that I liked, I set the blending mode of that layer to multiply. To make the splatters more unique and add some variation, I used two methods. First, I used a mixer brush to paint over the blood, which helped it seem more smeared and spread out. Second, I used the smudge brush. With the shrink set to around 60%, I painted along the blood to swirl it around a bit more. These two steps really help sell the effect that the blood is actually on the ground and not just a stock image thrown on. I used the same method for the blood on the subject's face and simply masked out the areas where I didn't want the blood to appear. Once I was happy with how the blood looked, I then added some dust particles. I really like adding these to some of my scenes as I feel it gives a sense of atmosphere to my images. The particles I used are from my Fire and Embers photo asset pack, which you can get on my Gumroad, link down in the description below. I simply dragged in the particle images, desaturated it, changed the blending mode to linear dodge, and played around with the positioning and scale. I then added a layer mask and painted away any extra particles that I thought were too much. Finishing off the atmospherics, I created a new layer behind my subject with the blending mode set to screen. I then used a large, soft, round brush with the flow set to around 10% and painted in light glows from the sources behind my subject. Next, I created a new layer above my subject with the blending mode set to linear dodge. Using that same brush set a little smaller, I painted over any light sources that were making contact with the edges of my subject's silhouette. By doing this, it helps show the light wrapping effect that happens when something is backlit. Following all of my effects, I then sharpened the entire image. To do this, I merged all visible layers into one single layer by holding Ctrl, Alt, and Shift and pressing E. I set that layer's blending mode to overlay and then went up to Filter, Other, and then High Pass Filter. I played around with the radius until I had the desired sharpness. For this image, it was around 2.5 pixels. For this image, I decided to add some chromatic aberration. To do this, I again merged all visible layers into a single layer. By double-clicking the layer, I was able to bring up the layer's blending options. While in the Blending Options tab, under Advanced Blending, I unchecked one of the RGB channels and hit OK. Depending on which box you uncheck, your chromatic aberration will be different colors. I then offset the entire layer to the left or right by a few pixels until I had the amount of aberration I wanted. I generally like there to be less of the effect on the face and eyes, so I created a layer mask and painted black over those areas. I then duplicated that layer, inverted the layer mask so the effect is now only showing on the face for that layer, and moved the layer's offset a little less. This effect is pretty obvious, so less is more when it comes to this. My color toning for this was a two-step process. First, I yet again merged all visible layers into a single layer. With that layer selected, I went to Filter and then Camera Raw. Within Camera Raw, I have a preset that I made that changes a few settings. The basics of this preset add clarity, contrast, vibrance, brings up the black point and lowers the white point with curves, and adds some light film grain. I also changed the white balance to be a bit more blue. And to finish off the color toning process, I created a new color lookup adjustment layer. Within this adjustment layer's properties, I can load up different LUTs, or lookup tables, which brings different color tones into my image. Once I found a LUT that I was happy with, I lowered the opacity of that adjustment layer to finish off the entire image. Here's the before, and this is the final edit. Guys, I hope you liked this video. If you did, maybe give it a thumbs up. If you have any other editing techniques that you want me to break down for you, let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, go ahead and check out the lighting breakdown for this image in my previous video. And until next time, stay creative.